The last words Daniel Cruz heard before his life ended were whispered through Isabella's trembling lips, "I'm so sorry." Seconds later, the sound of a saw slicing through flesh echoed in the room, a gruesome act orchestrated by her Mafia husband, Antonio Moretti. What brought them to this horrifying moment? This is a tale of forbidden passion, betrayal, and the terrifying grip of power. From a steamy love affair to a shocking murder, a harrowing trial, and the collapse of a feared Mafia empire, stay tuned as we unravel the chilling story of Antonio, Isabella, and Daniel. Antonio Moretti, at 45 years old, was the epitome of power and danger. A Mafia boss with vast wealth and influence, he controlled a criminal empire that stretched across cities, manipulating everyone and everything in his path. His mere presence commanded fear, his sharp suits and cold gaze making even the bravest tremble. Isabella Moretti, his 28-year-old wife, was the picture of beauty, elegant, reserved, and always the perfect wife. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes held secrets, but no one ever questioned her outward composure. She had been swept into Antonio's world of luxury, and yet, beneath the gilded cage of wealth, she felt more trapped than ever. Her life, though extravagant, was no more than a polished prison, her every move monitored, her every word scrutinized by the man who claimed to love her. Their love story had once been the stuff of dreams. Antonio and Isabella were inseparable, bound by passion and shared ambition. Their union was the ideal picture, he the powerful Mafia boss, she the perfect, devoted wife. The public adored them, they were the couple everyone aspired to be. On business trips, Antonio never went without Isabella, and her presence was his most cherished accessory. They lived for each other, their love so intense that it seemed unbreakable. But as the years went by, the bond they shared began to deteriorate. Antonio, once affectionate and devoted, started to withdraw. He became distant, and his eyes no longer held the same warmth when they met hers. He was always busy, late-night meetings, endless business deals, trips that kept him away for days. He would make excuses, telling her it was just work, that it was for their future. But Isabella noticed the changes, the late hours, the tiredness in his eyes when he returned home, the strange perfume on his clothes. The lipstick stains that were not hers. Isabella's heart began to crack as she pieced together the truth, Antonio, her once doting husband, was cheating on her. The man who had promised her the world was now breaking the very vows he had made. She felt invisible, left behind as he sought the comfort of other women. The realization hurt her more deeply than anything, the sting of betrayal settling in her chest like a constant ache. Her loneliness grew with each passing day. She began to question her worth, her role in Antonio's life. Was she just a trophy? An ornament in his world of wealth and danger? The passionate love she once felt was now overshadowed by a growing void. She could no longer ignore the signs, he was not just neglecting her emotionally, he was doing so physically, as his attention drifted toward his affairs. But Isabella was not helpless. She began to investigate, to follow the breadcrumbs that Antonio had left behind. She snooped through his belongings, found receipts from hotels, and, one night, after receiving a tip, she walked in on him and one of his mistresses in a hotel room. The confrontation was brutal. Antonio, instead of apologizing or showing remorse, laughed in her face, rubbing his betrayal in her wounds. He had no fear of her, she could do nothing to him. She was his wife, a possession, a prize to be kept in the shadows while he did as he pleased. And so, Isabella began to withdraw further, feeling more isolated and powerless. Yet, this was when the true betrayal began. Antonio, in an effort to control her even more, hired a personal bodyguard for Isabella. Daniel Cruz, a man 13 years her senior, was strong, stoic, and sharp-eyed. He was hired to watch her, to keep her safe, though Isabella quickly realized that he was much more than just a bodyguard. His charm and attentiveness, the very things Antonio had neglected, began to draw her in. The warmth she had longed for started to radiate from Daniel, and in the emptiness left by Antonio's indifference, she found solace in his arms. It was a dangerous, forbidden romance, one that would bring everything crashing down. But Isabella, starved for affection, couldn't resist. Daniel gave her the attention and care she had not received from her husband for so long. She found herself lost in their secret moments, their whispered promises, and the stolen kisses in the shadows. They knew the risk, but it was one they were willing to take. Their affair ignited with passion, each encounter more intense than the last, and as they slipped deeper into each other, they ignored the dark consequences that would eventually catch up with them. The lines between loyalty, betrayal, and love blurred, setting the stage for the unimaginable tragedy that would soon unfold. In the midst of it all, Isabella was torn. She loved Antonio, the man who had swept her into a world of wealth and luxury. Yet, it was Daniel who made her feel alive again, who made her feel seen. Antonio's affair, his indifference, and his betrayal had pushed her into the arms of the very man he had hired to watch over her. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that would lead to an irreversible breaking point. And little did she know, the man she had been most desperate to escape was watching, waiting, and plotting his next move, ready to unleash a horrific vengeance that no one could have anticipated. As Antonio's absences became more frequent, Isabella found herself increasingly alone, the walls of their luxurious mansion closing in on her. Gone were the days when Antonio would bring her along on his business trips, when they would share the world as one. Now, she was left behind, her only company the silence of their empty home. He would return late at night, always claiming that business had kept him longer than expected. But Isabella, feeling the weight of her growing isolation, knew better. The perfume on his clothes, the lipstick stains on his shirts, and the faint scent of other women in their bed were no longer things she could ignore. Antonio had begun flaunting his infidelities without shame, meeting with his mistresses openly and leaving Isabella in the dark, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. He no longer tried to hide the fact that he was no longer hers alone. Isabella, a woman once adored and cherished, now became a ghost in her own marriage. The love and devotion she had poured into Antonio had withered, replaced by a bitter resentment that festered inside her. She spent her days in solitude, aimlessly wandering the grand halls of their mansion, wondering what had gone wrong. The man she had once thought to be the love of her life was now nothing more than a distant figure, a shadow in her past. Her heart, once filled with passion, was now a hollow shell, echoing with memories of a time when they were inseparable. Antonio, for all his power and control, began to notice the subtle changes in Isabella. She had begun to glow again, her once dim eyes now bright with a newfound energy. She dressed more carefully, paid more attention to her appearance, and smiled more often. The woman he had long ignored was now radiating a happiness that he couldn't explain. But what troubled him the most was the sudden lack of attention she paid to him. She no longer hung on his every word, no longer begged for his approval or affection. Isabella had pulled away from him emotionally, and he couldn't fathom why. At first, Antonio tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or a passing phase. But as the weeks went by, his suspicions grew. He began to question her more, probing her for answers she wasn't willing to give. He asked her about her new behavior, her absences, her frequent disappearances into the guest room for hours on end. Isabella, ever the actress, lied, carefully guarding the secret that burned between her and Daniel. When he questioned Daniel, Antonio's suspicions grew even more. Daniel was polite, professional, and answered every question with the same calm demeanor, denying any knowledge of Isabella seeing anyone else. He swore that his only concern was Isabella's safety and well-being, nothing more. Yet, Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He hired private investigators to keep tabs on Isabella, watching her every move with meticulous precision. But despite their efforts, the truth remained elusive. The spies he employed reported nothing of importance, leaving Antonio with nothing but his own growing unease. The deeper Antonio dug, the more convinced he became that Isabella was hiding something from him. His once unshakable confidence began to waver as he realized that he was losing control over the one thing that mattered to him most, his wife. The growing distance between them was a threat he could no longer ignore. And so, Antonio decided to take matters into his own hands, vowing that he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the truth was far darker and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. The affair between Isabella and Daniel was only the beginning, and it would soon set in motion a series of events that would tear their lives apart forever. Antonio, ever the master of manipulation, had a plan to get to the bottom of his suspicions. His mind, sharp and calculating, devised a scheme that would give him the answers he desperately sought. He told Isabella that he would be leaving for a 3-day business trip to Turkey, a trip he had to make alone. With his departure, Antonio gave Isabella and Daniel the perfect opportunity to act on the desire that had been building between them for months. It seemed like a harmless affair, just a stolen moment away from prying eyes, a chance for Isabella to escape the prison her marriage had become. Little did they know, it would be the very thing that would destroy them. Isabella, emboldened by the temporary freedom, made plans to meet Daniel. It had been weeks since they had last shared a moment alone, and the tension between them had become unbearable. Daniel, aware of the risks, was hesitant at first. He knew how dangerous their secret was, how deadly the consequences could be if Antonio ever found out. But the temptation was too great. The lust and longing they felt for each other had taken on a life of its own, and neither could resist it. They decided that this time, they would risk it all. The bedroom, Antonio and Isabella's matrimonial sanctuary, would be the setting for their most intimate moment yet. Isabella insisted they use the bed, the very place where her marriage had once flourished. She wanted to feel as close to Daniel as possible, to make the moment feel real, even if it meant crossing an unforgivable line. The familiar sheets, the scent of her husband's cologne still lingering in the air, all served to heighten the illicitness of their affair. What they didn't know was that Antonio had never left. He had lied to them both. Instead of traveling to Turkey, he had returned to the mansion that very night, choosing to stay hidden and observe from the shadows. He had grown suspicious of Isabella's behavior, the secretive glances, the too perfect appearances. He knew that something was wrong, and his gut told him that it was time to act. Antonio watched as his wife and his bodyguard, the man he trusted, shared the moment he had once reserved for only himself. It was a sight that would haunt him forever. The moment Antonio saw them together in the bed they had once shared, everything snapped. The betrayal hit him like a freight train, a wave of rage and disbelief crashing over him. His heart pounded in his chest, and the suffocating weight of betrayal crushed him. How could she do this to him? How could Daniel, someone he trusted to protect her, betray him in the most intimate way possible? Antonio's reaction was immediate, brutal, and unrelenting. In an instant, his rage consumed him. He stormed into the room, his eyes wild with fury. The sight of Isabella and Daniel, tangled in the sheets, completely unaware of his presence, drove him to the brink of madness. He ordered his men to restrain Daniel, the man who had not only betrayed his trust but had also dared to steal his wife's love. Isabella, frozen in shock, could barely comprehend what was happening. Her heart raced as Antonio's cold, unforgiving gaze fell upon her. He didn't need to say a word for her to understand the depth of his fury. The tension in the room was palpable as Antonio turned his gaze toward Isabella, his eyes full of contempt and pain. She had broken the sacred trust between them, and he would make her pay for it. In that moment, Antonio's anger turned into something more sinister, a thirst for vengeance. The man who had always controlled everything in his life, who had ruled with an iron fist, now found himself stripped of that control. He was consumed by the desire to exact the most brutal punishment he could imagine. Antonio had never been a man to forgive, and this act of betrayal would not go unpunished. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. A plan that would not only punish Isabella and Daniel but would also send a message to anyone who dared to cross him. He looked at Isabella, his face twisted in a mixture of fury and disbelief, and made his demands clear. The consequences would be unimaginable, and there would be no way out. Antonio's thirst for revenge would not be quenched until he had made them both suffer for the betrayal that had shattered his world. Antonio's voice cut through the tense silence, sending a shiver down Isabella's spine. She could barely comprehend the horrific demand he was making, yet the cold, calculated look in his eyes left no room for doubt. Antonio Moretti, the man who had once been her world, was now a stranger, a monster driven by rage and a thirst for vengeance. He didn't need to say much, his intentions were clear. With a cruel, chilling calm, he ordered his men to restrain Daniel, their grip tightening as they held him in place, rendering him powerless to escape. Isabella stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight of Daniel, her lover, the man she had risked everything for, bound and helpless before her was almost too much to bear. The realization of what was about to unfold crashed over her like a tidal wave. But Antonio wasn't done yet. He walked over to a nearby table, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. He picked up a saw, a sharp, jagged tool meant for one purpose only, and turned it towards Isabella. His gaze locked onto hers, icy and unyielding. "Either you kill him, Isabella," he growled, his voice low and menacing, "or I'll make sure you both die tonight." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't fathom what he was asking of her. She had always feared Antonio's wrath, but never in her wildest nightmares did she imagine he would force her into this. Desperately, she looked at Daniel, her eyes pleading for some kind of miracle. But Daniel, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief, could do nothing but watch as his fate was sealed. Isabella's voice broke through the air, her pleas trembling with desperation. "Please, Antonio, no. I can't. I can't do this," she cried, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at the saw. Her body felt like it was betraying her as she stood, paralyzed by the sheer horror of the situation. "Please, don't make me do this. I love him." But Antonio's face remained unchanged, cold, ruthless, implacable. He didn't flinch at her cries, didn't offer an ounce of mercy. "I said do it," he spat, his voice growing colder. "If you don't, I will make sure you both suffer in ways you can't even imagine. Do it now, or I'll kill you both." His words were final, cutting through the room like a blade. Isabella's hands trembled uncontrollably as she reached for the saw. Her mind screamed in protest, but her body moved against her will. The tears streamed down her face as she looked at Daniel, his expression a mix of disbelief, fear, and sorrow. He had been her protector, her lover, and now he was at her mercy. The saw felt foreign in her hands, the metal cold and unforgiving as she raised it, her hands shaking with the weight of what she was about to do. Daniel's voice cracked, barely a whisper as he tried to meet her eyes. "I love you, Isabella. I'm sorry. I never wanted this to happen. Just end it." The words broke something inside of her. She had never imagined this moment would come, the moment where she had to choose between saving her own life or taking the life of the man she loved. And yet, here she was, her hands covered in the consequences of her choices. Tears blurred her vision as she made the first cut. The sound of the saw scraping against flesh was sickening, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Daniel's screams filled the room, but Isabella couldn't stop. She couldn't stop even as every inch of her body screamed for mercy, for a way out. His body writhed beneath her, each movement a reminder of the act she was being forced to commit. But there was no escape. The act felt like an eternity, but eventually, it was done. The sight of Daniel's lifeless body, his head severed from his body, was something that would forever be etched in Isabella's mind. Her hands were covered in blood, her body shaking from the weight of what she had just done. She felt sick, violated, and empty inside. She had just taken a life, and nothing could undo it. Antonio, his face unreadable, stood silently by, watching it all unfold. As soon as the deed was done, he nodded to his men, who immediately began to dispose of Daniel's body, erasing all traces of the man from their lives. Isabella could only stand there, trembling, her heart breaking as she realized what she had become, a victim of Antonio's cruel manipulation and control. Antonio's voice cut through the silence once again, sending a shiver down Isabella's spine. "This will be your life now, Isabella," he said coldly. "You will never escape me. You'll never be free again. And if you ever think of betraying me again, I'll make sure your death is slow and painful." Isabella was left standing there, broken and terrified, the blood of the man she had once loved staining her hands. She was now a prisoner, bound to Antonio's control for the rest of her life, her guilt and trauma consuming her every waking moment. Life within the confines of Antonio Moretti's mansion became a suffocating prison for Isabella. Each day felt like an eternity, a never-ending nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her once vibrant existence was now reduced to nothing more than a shadow of her former self, as she moved through her days with heavy, unblinking eyes, a prisoner to the man who had once been her lover, but now was her tormentor. Antonio had tightened his grip on her in ways that went beyond physical confinement, his control over her every move was absolute. He no longer trusted her alone for even a moment, and she was shadowed by his men wherever she went. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and luxury, now felt like a gilded cage. The walls seemed to close in tighter each day, and Isabella could no longer find solace in the grand rooms that had once been her sanctuary. Her every thought was consumed by the brutal act she had been forced to commit, the image of Daniel's lifeless body haunted her in every waking hour. Each moment she spent alone was an agonizing reminder of the atrocity that had occurred under her hands, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest until it felt as if she might suffocate from it. Antonio's presence in the house only amplified her torment. He was always watching, always waiting for the slightest sign of rebellion. His cold, calculating nature never wavered, and each interaction with him felt like a rehearsal of cruelty. At times, she would catch him watching her with a look in his eyes that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul, knowing the horrors she had experienced, yet offering no reprieve. Isabella knew there would never be an escape from his grasp. She was bound to him, emotionally, mentally, and physically, for the rest of her life. But even in the darkest corners of her mind, a spark of defiance remained. Despite Antonio's efforts to erase her agency and reduce her to an obedient shell of a woman, Isabella found solace in a secret act, a small rebellion against the world that had become her prison. In the quiet hours of the night, when Antonio slept soundly in their shared bed, she would retreat to a hidden corner of the house, a forgotten nook in the farthest wing. There, in the shadows, she began to write. Her journal, once a place for daydreams and reflections of a life she longed to live, became her sanctuary. She poured her pain, guilt, and confusion into the pages, documenting the details of the crime that had shattered her world. Each entry, every word, was a catharsis, a way for Isabella to purge her soul of the venom Antonio had forced her to swallow. She wrote about Daniel. The love they had shared, the way his gentle hands had touched her in the moments of stolen privacy, the way he had made her feel seen in a world that had forgotten her. She described in vivid detail the horror of the night she was forced to take his life, the sound of the saw as it scraped through flesh, and the look of betrayal in his eyes as her hands trembled in the act. She wrote about the aftermath, the crushing weight of Antonio's control, and the way her soul had shattered, piece by piece. In these stolen moments of privacy, Isabella allowed herself to imagine a future where she could tell the truth, where Antonio's reign of terror would come to an end, and where justice might be served. But deep down, she knew it was a distant dream, a fantasy that felt impossible in the face of the monster who held her captive. The journal became her confession, her only way of processing the trauma and holding on to a fragment of the truth. She made no attempts to hide it from Antonio, he didn't care enough to look. But she knew that one day, her words might be the key to unraveling the web of lies and power that Antonio had so carefully constructed around them. She wrote, not just for herself, but for Daniel, too, for the man who had given her love and affection, only to be silenced by a cruel twist of fate. She wrote in the hope that, one day, someone would find it, someone who would believe her, who would piece together the fragments of her story and expose Antonio's reign of terror to the world. The journal, though small and fragile, became her most powerful weapon, a secret weapon she clung to in the hope that it would one day bring the truth to light. Each entry felt like a tiny rebellion, a reminder that despite the walls Antonio had built around her, Isabella still had the power to speak. Even if it was only to herself, she would not be silenced. 2 years after Isabella was forced into the depths of despair and guilt, Antonio's empire began to unravel, not because of his cruelty toward her, but due to a series of unrelated criminal activities that drew the attention of law enforcement. As a mafia boss with connections that reached deep into the city's underworld, Antonio had been involved in multiple illicit operations, ranging from money laundering to weapons trafficking. His wealth, power, and influence had kept him safe from the law for decades, but even the most impenetrable empires have their cracks. The police investigation, initially focused on other criminal enterprises connected to Antonio, took a dramatic turn when authorities raided his mansion, hoping to uncover evidence that could take down his entire network. Antonio had always been cautious about keeping his most sinister secrets under lock and key, but even he couldn't protect every corner of his domain. As law enforcement combed through the luxurious estate, they stumbled upon something unexpected: Isabella's journal. Hidden in a corner of her personal quarters, the journal was discovered by an officer during a routine search. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than the ramblings of a woman, perhaps an innocent means of venting, but as the officers flipped through the pages, they began to realize they had uncovered something far more sinister. The journal chronicled every painful detail of Isabella's life under Antonio's control, her fear, her guilt, and most shockingly, her forced participation in the murder of Daniel Cruz. The pages painted a chilling picture of the events that had transpired in the Moretti household, from the initial betrayal to the horrific ultimatum Antonio had placed on his wife. It became clear that Daniel's death was not a crime of passion or an act of self-defense, but a cold, calculated murder orchestrated by the very man who had claimed to love her. The officers, stunned by the revelations, knew they had to act swiftly. Isabella's detailed accounts of the crime, along with the chilling way in which Antonio had coerced her, were more than enough to launch a full investigation into his actions. Isabella, though devastated and terrified, was now caught between the walls of the truth and the authority of the law. The police had everything they needed to arrest her, and soon, she was taken into custody. But the arrest of Isabella was only the beginning. Isabella, no longer the frightened woman under Antonio's thumb, made a decision that would ultimately change the course of the investigation. She agreed to cooperate with authorities, willing to testify against the man who had destroyed her life. It wasn't an easy choice. Her fear of Antonio's retribution still lingered, but the weight of her guilt and the torment of living with the memory of her actions finally pushed her to break her silence. In her testimony, Isabella revealed the full extent of Antonio's manipulation and cruelty, detailing how he had orchestrated Daniel's death in a cold, calculated manner. She spoke of the months of torment, the psychological abuse, and the ultimate choice she had been given, the choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her words were the final piece of the puzzle that authorities needed to bring Antonio Moretti to justice. The case that unfolded in court sent shockwaves through the city, as the once feared mafia boss was finally held accountable for his crimes. Isabella's testimony was a turning point, not just in her own life, but in the lives of those who had lived in fear of Antonio's empire. Though her role in Daniel's death was undeniable, the jury could not ignore the fact that she had been manipulated and coerced by a man who had shown her no mercy. The trial was a battle of power and control. Antonio's legal team tried to discredit Isabella, painting her as a willing accomplice, a woman who had willingly participated in the affair and the murder. But Isabella's courage and the evidence from her journal were too powerful to ignore. The court saw through Antonio's attempts to silence the truth, and in the end, justice was served. Antonio Moretti was convicted of multiple crimes, including the orchestrated murder of Daniel Cruz, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Isabella, though still haunted by her actions, was granted a lesser sentence for her cooperation with authorities and was placed under protective custody. Her life, forever scarred by the choices she had made, would never return to what it once was. But in the eyes of the law, she had finally gained some measure of justice. Though Isabella's path to redemption was long and fraught with pain, the exposure of Antonio's true nature brought some sense of closure. Antonio's empire crumbled with his arrest, and the fear that had once ruled Isabella's life slowly began to fade. The story of Isabella Moretti became a symbol of the extreme lengths to which some will go to maintain control, and the terrifying consequences of betrayal within a toxic relationship. In the end, the chilling tale of Antonio Moretti's empire comes to a bitter conclusion, with the legacy of his manipulation and control haunting everyone involved. Isabella, once a victim of his dominance and violence, paid the highest price, her soul and conscience stained by the murder she had been forced to commit. Her journey from fear to defiance, from guilt to courage, revealed the profound cost of love and betrayal. Though Antonio's quest for power and control ultimately consumed him, it was the complex emotions of love, guilt, and courage that led to his downfall. Isabella, once trapped in the gilded cage of luxury, found a way out. Though the scars of her past would never fully fade, she had finally broken free from his grip. It was love's betrayal, the heartache of guilt, and the strength of courage that ultimately unmasked the truth. Antonio's greed and lust for power were his. What does this story teach us about the darker side of power and control? And what would you do if faced with an impossible choice like Isabella's? Would you have been able to make the same decision? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Real True Crime Stories for more chilling true crime stories that continue to captivate and haunt the human psyche.